There's another type of object you can make in 3D Studio Max, and those are called shapes. So there's all different kinds of shapes you can make as well. There's the standard ones, and there's extended splines as well. So we come in here, the most basic one is a line. And if I just click in a viewport, that line that I make is going to have straight edges. But if I click and drag, that line that I make is going to have a curve to it. And this is called a Bezier curve, which means the longer that I drag for, the more influence this curve is going to have, or sort of the straighter it's going to be, in fact. If I don't drag it for very long, okay, it can be a fairly narrow or a very sharp curve. But if I drag it longer, it's going to have more influence, that segment of the curve. And then if I can choose to, I can click out here, or I can right click and finish the shape and it would be an open shape. Or if I click somewhere very near the first point that I drew, it will ask me if I want to close it, and I can hit yes, and then I can have a closed spline. And you can drag and draw several more basic types of shapes, circles and rectangles and such. You can also draw this neat one, a helix, which actually starts out as a circle. Then when you drag upwards, it actually becomes a little spiral, and then you can drag again, and it will increase the taper, I suppose, of that spiral. And you can give it more turns if you want to. And the cool thing about shapes in 3D Studio is that they're just curves, so they really have no true thickness at all, and they don't ordinarily render. But if you go to the Modify panel, you actually have a rendering section for any shape, and you can, one, enable it in render, and then as I render this thing, or as I render it, it will show up in the render. So you can use it to create very fine lined shapes, but you can also enable it in the viewport. And if I just maximize that a little bit, we can see it. And you can give it a thickness, and you can give it a number of sides in case it's a little bit too chunky. 12 is plenty. But this is really cool because it allows me to create some geometry without actually creating any geometry. So I haven't actually sort of created any, and if I look in sort of the wireframe view, it'll show up as geometry as well, but I did nothing more than to draw a shape. So come over here and get rid of that stuff. You can also create, in the Shapes panel here, you can create text. So in the front, I'm just going to click, and this is a sample text it gives me, which is kind of self-centered there, I guess. Max text. It's max. But if we go to the modify, and the reason that this is showing up at all is because, remember, 3D Studio has that funky thing of where if I've set some parameters in some similar object before, those parameters propagate through to that new object that I make. It's to be honest, I don't know. I guess it's trying to be helpful, but it's a little bit weird. So in this case, my max text, it's kind of devilish, I guess, and that's because I had the last shape that I drew, I enabled it in the render and the viewport with a certain thickness and a certain number of sides. And so what it's doing is it's sort of assuming that I want those same parameters for any new shapes that I create. Even though text is a completely different shape than the helix that I drew, it still kind of makes this assumption. So what we'll do is we'll just uncheck enable, because I don't want to enable that. And then I get, this is a more basic kind of a text. That's a little bit hard to see, actually, so let's make it something that's a little bit easier to see. And now my text consists only of the outlines of that text. And another way to make this text visible is if I go to Modifier, and I can do what's called an extrude, or I can do what's called a bevel. And that bevel is going to allow me several different levels of bevel to give this text some dimensionality. So I can come in and give it a height. There, it has a thickness. And let's say, well, this text is kind of boring, so I'm going to go back through, back to my original text, and you can see down here, you can type whatever text you want. So So and you can see it allows you to enter multiple lines of text. And then if you enter multiple lines of text, you can have control over the centering, the justification, that sort of thing, the kerning and the leading there. So how close they get between lines and between characters. And then, of course, I can change the font. And so if I come over to something that I know is relatively thick here, impact, yeah, there we go.